everyone, and welcome back to Cow Talks. I am Marcelo Wallau, Forage Extension Specialist with the University of Florida and an agricultural producer myself. On this podcast, we explore the many facets of agricultural production systems to discuss the technical aspects and decision-making processes that shape the competitiveness and long-term sustainability of our farms and ranches. Join me in these conversations where I explore the minds of different professionals to bring multiple perspectives to the challenges and opportunities facing modern agriculture. Hello and welcome to Cow Talks. My name is Marcelo Wallau. I'm the Forage Extension Specialist with the University of Florida. And today we have two special guests to talk about disaster. What does that have to do with livestock? Well, a lot, and especially with broad sense agriculture. My guests today are Dr. Lindsey, Associate Professor in Family, Youth, and Consumer Science with the University of Florida. And she conducts research and outreach activities around disaster preparedness and recovery in communities. Our second guest is Dr. Christa, also Associate Professor of Regional Economics and Director for the Economic Impact Analysis Program. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, glad to be here.
I've been thinking about having you in our podcast for quite a while because you work with disaster, and right in the middle of this winter, we had several events. We got many emails from you, lots of things that you've been doing, especially with specialty crops. But those disasters also affected beef cattle and dairy producers a lot because of the damage to cool season forages especially. So I thought it would be fantastic to bring both of you here to explore a little more of what happened this year, and also what is disaster, what we do, and what is the role that UFIFAS, FDACS, and then USDA and the different FSA and the different agencies have in this whole process. Let me start with this question. So what happened this year? Why was different in terms of disaster for this winter?
I'll take that one. I think we were all relieved to have zero landfall of hurricane for the past hurricane season, and taking a little bit of a breather, and then comes both drought affecting the state of Florida as well as some freeze events. Starting in late December, we had several freeze events that affected different parts of the state, and the one that was associated with the winter storm that you might know as Winter Storm Gianna, you may or may not know that winter storms have names, but it lasted for several days and it affected almost the entire state, with temperatures below 32 degrees, many areas with temperatures below 28 degrees, which would be a hard freeze. And particularly different from past events is that scope of the state that was impacted and the duration of the temperatures below freezing, which is particularly important to both the crops and the animals.
So we have two components to that, is not only how cold it got, but how long it stayed.
And it got particularly cold, and it stayed really cold for a long time. Some areas of the state experienced temperatures below freezing for almost a full 24 hours.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is a lot. And also, if I'm not mistaken, we had frost all the way to pretty much to Miami-Dade County, all the way to South Florida, right? Where is the area that we normally grow.
Right. It's a growing season.
The tropical crops. Or early temperate crops.
Yeah, it's two things. It's those tropical crops that don't want to be that cold at all, ever. And also it's our winter season for a lot of the specialty crops that you mentioned before. So other areas of the country are not producing at this time when it's more common for it to be this cold.
Of course.
But in Florida, we are.
So in terms of the economic impact, was not only because of the reduction in productivity, but also the placement in market, right?
Exactly.
We should be the first ones getting that sweet corn, that watermelon,
That's
which,
right.
By the way, lots of our beef cattle producers are also partnering with many of those other enterprises. So that become important.
Yeah, we often hear Florida's a specialty crop state, but we're also a market window state where, that first 2 or 3 weeks is really important because we're the only ones to market, and there's a different price before everyone comes. Georgia and other countries are ready.
So from the numbers I could gather, from what is available today, which is late March as we're recording this, the estimate total loss for Florida agriculture is over $3.1 billion. And this is a number that is from FDACS.
Correct.
Our research is not out there yet.
Correct. So we typically also produce a number. It's almost ready, not quite out yet, because We're used to dealing with hurricanes and estimating numbers for production losses after a hurricane. And as you can imagine, a freeze event is very different. So we spent a lot of time, or at least I've spent a lot of time in traveling the state and learning what happened so that we were doing it just right. So ours are almost ready.
So which were the crops that were most affected this year by the frost?
Yeah, I think that you'll see it was a lot of those specialty crops in South Florida that were already in the ground, a lot of vegetables. Sugarcane was particularly impacted, and it's another one where we don't deal with it too much during hurricane season, or at least during the particular events that we have analyzed over the last 5 years. But in this freeze event was hit particularly hard.
So some of the numbers here have, you mentioned sugarcane, also citrus, and citrus is a pretty sad situation because it's an industry that has already suffered so much loss with the citrus greening, and now more. And this is a little bit out of script here, but if you think about the 1880s, and then there was a few events in the early 1900s that pretty much tipped the point in citrus. So we stopped growing citrus in this region here, which was Orange Lake, Orange Heights. All that citrus then went down south. It's already been impacted by the greening plus the frost. What do you think is going to be the impact for the whole citrus industry with this other event now?
Yeah, I think they've been dealing with compound situations for a long time. You often hear about the citrus greening. You hear about urban development affecting the areas that were traditionally citrus areas. There are different things going on with, imports. Luckily, they start harvesting in October. So it's not the entire season for citrus that was impacted. It's sort of those late season varieties. I suppose that a freeze event is very similar to a hurricane in that it affects that particular production for that particular year, but the tree is still there. So it will really depend on whether or not they were able to implement freeze protection. A lot of them use the irrigation system for freeze protection, and then what happened to both the blossoms, the fruit, or the tree itself to determine that.
So citrus, big problem. Sugarcane, also much larger than any of us would experience in the past with other disasters. Sweet corn, because a lot of the sweet corn was planted early in South Florida, so we can hit that market. But two of the main crops that we produce here in the state, and including are responsible for the majority of the royalties we get as University of Florida, are strawberries and blueberries. What about those two?
I think blueberries is also similar to the story I was telling on sugarcane, where during typical hurricane season, they're not in season, or at least they're not in harvest season. The bushes are still out there and potentially affected by something like high winds or flooding, but it's again something else that we don't need to include as much of their production during hurricane season. Totally different for this time of year and hit by a freeze event. And I know that there were, very similar to citrus again, farmers that were trying to implement freeze protection in order to protect the fruit that was already on the bush. In some cases, the irrigation system failed because the temperatures were so low. And then now it sort of the opposite effect happened. They tried to use the water to protect the fruit, but now there was too much water because the irrigation system had an issue. So now that affects the bush and future production from that particular bush. So I think it's a large majority of the acreage of blueberries was affected here, if not all of it. And it was a particularly bad time for them as well.
Wow. This is as I said, is a compound issue.
Yeah.
Loss of crop, damage to that perennial crop, the tree or the bush, that's going to affect in coming years. Yeah. When I was looking at the damage we had in forages, and I mean forages we normally think is a more resilient crop, and also the values we're working are low. We're not talking about thousands of dollars per acre. We're normally talking about a couple $100 per acre to establish that. But the product that comes out of that forage, the milk, the meat, specifically, more specifically, the milk, we're working a lot with the dairies, is super valuable. So I don't know the impact in that industry, but while I was looking into the data that we gathered for this year, was a 61% reduction in productivity only, not even thinking about quality of that crop. With both productivity and quality are going to affect the output in terms of milk per acre that we can get. So I haven't seen that number around yet, but I know from our experience this year, which was the first time I've seen so much damage in forages. Yeah, I think it's pretty significant for the dairy industry. They normally use more corn anyhow, but the ones that are more diversified and plant. They lost a lot of money this year from the cold damage. And then a lot of these cattle operations, they are not using irrigation, so they planted late already because of the drought in fall, summer and then fall that continues persist today. So a lot of reduction in production in pastures all over. $3.1 billion today, according to FDAX. We're still looking to see what the numbers from your research group, Christa, is going to show. But this is today. We expect this to continue. So this loss is going to probably continue for a couple of more years, I imagine.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in everything that you just talked about there. So one of the things that, again, I'll go back to examples of past hurricane seasons. Sometimes people are surprised at how high the number is for a particular county. And often that's because of low acreage, but very high value crop, right? The opposite is really potentially true for a lot of these field row crops, forage crops, where it's potentially a lower value per acre, but a lot of acres were impacted. So it doesn't mean that number will be particularly low. It's kind of that combination of the amount of acreage that was impacted and then the value per acre. And then the other thing you mentioned is these sort of supply chain impacts, let's say. So when our group estimates these numbers, we focus on a rapid assessment of production losses for a particular season. So often that will look at, like we said, an orange fell off a tree or the forage crop for this particular season, but it wouldn't include changes to the quality of the milk or the amount of milk that's able to be produced because of the change in quality of that forage for a particular year. So those are all in addition to any number that would come out of my program. And they're particularly interesting because the other example we can give here is for sugarcane. So there's a value of the sugarcane itself, but you're not going to do anything other than make sugar out of that sugarcane. So you can also look at the value of the sugar from that acreage of sugarcane that was impacted, the value of juice from the oranges that were affected, because 90% plus of our oranges grown in Florida go into orange juice. So these are all, super interesting things to think about. And yes, I think you're exactly right that the impact of the freeze will go on in the medium and long term. Decisions about, what do we do next year because this happened? And one other connection between the drought situation and the freeze that's happening right now is, okay, let's say a crop was impacted by the freeze but not killed, and it's trying to grow back. It's trying to go back under drought conditions right now. and in some areas still in sort of depressed temperatures, temperatures that are a little bit lower than they would normally be expecting right now because of those freeze events that kept happening. Maybe in South Florida, it didn't get all the way to a freeze or a hard freeze in all of those events, but it was still particularly cold for the winter. That'll be an impact for next year, is that there was either a shorter growing season or it was affecting the growth speed of these crops that we don't expect to be ready until next year.
And that puts things in perspective and makes sense why the numbers sometimes are so high. Do you also account for the cost of opportunity?
No, and that was the other thing I was going to mention. For a lot of things to unpack there, as you mentioned, maybe not having the forage or having to spend money on feed because you don't have the forage available. So when I talk about production losses, there's really two components of that. There's your expected revenue for the year and how that changed because of a disaster event. But there's additional event-specific costs that either you were preparing for the event. Sometimes, people are putting hazard mitigation costs that they sort of implement all year long, or they plan for general risk mitigation. But if you did something for this specific event, so for a hurricane, I can think of examples like there are some nurseries that are growing particularly big plants that may go, spend some extra money on labor and lay the plants down so they're not tossed around during a hurricane and then have to stand them back up. For tomatoes, I've heard of having to restake the tomatoes after a hurricane. If they were implementing freeze protection for a particular freeze event, that's an increasing cost from that specific event that is also affecting the bottom line. So those are the types of things we would love to hear about in our survey so that we fully understand this, so that we're talking about both of those things when we start to speak with anybody who's making these decisions related to disaster relief.
There is a lot of information that we need to gather to be able to assess that.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that both of you do, is try to get that information to assess. If I understand well, you more from the economic perspective, you more from the big picture perspective, like the community perspective, right? I want to understand a little more this process of collecting data and what we do with that, because there is a process for declaration of disaster in the federal and state level, and there are consequences or benefits, however you want to put, kind of benefits of the disaster, but there's consequences of that being declared or not. Can you explain, Angie, a little bit to us how this process happens, the different surveys you have in this that leads into the declaration of disaster or not?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's something that happens at that state and federal level that we are kind of tangentially involved in. I definitely think more so now that we've had so many hurricanes in the past several years, and they look to Christa's data a good bit, especially FSA and USDA. I mean, obviously they have their data, but looking at the data collectively as like a big picture overall and making sure to declare that disaster, basically. As far as how we are necessarily involved, especially we usually find out at that state level first. And so understanding that, and that's a lot of times where we're brought in or we're not brought in, but based upon how is it going to be funded? Is the federal government going to pay for this response effort or not going to pay for the response efforts? So a lot of the decisions are made based upon that declaration at that state level. And so a lot of times that depends on how much or how little, a lot of times, that we are brought into that response efforts also.
When we're talking about financing or sponsoring that response effort, we're talking about the work to understand the disaster, not actually the compensation for the disaster per se, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. The kind of personal time. Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's complicated. And I don't even want to say that I understand it at all, because I don't. And so in understanding that compensation and the reimbursement, and so a lot of that can be very complicated. And I think it often depends on what type of disaster it is. Like Christa was talking about, is it a freeze event? Is it a hurricane? And was it a wind event? Was it a flood event? So those kind of factors actually factor into that as well.
Understood. And in this case, talking about those winter events we had, they ended up being classified as disaster after a while, right?
Yes. Yeah. I'll let Christa talk about that.
Yes. When we say a disaster designation, it's looking for a secretarial designation of a natural disaster, and this being the Secretary of Agriculture at the federal level. Mm-hmm. What they need in order for that to be designated is reports coming into the USDA Farm Service Agency that demonstrate 30% loss or more for one particular crop, or at least one particular crop in an area. So what we do while we are collecting data for our research, we're also sort of meeting with them and informing them on what we're hearing through our survey, in addition to what they're hearing from those reports that are coming directly into the Farm Service Agency. And they come into a local or county or regional office. Those offices have a county emergency board that meets to go over the information that came in at the county level. They send that information to the state level. There's a state emergency board that will meet and go over what they received from the counties. And then the executive director of the Farm Service Agency sends information up to the federal level to make that decision. When a county is designated for a disaster, it automatically opens up certain programs, and depending on what was in that letter, what was experienced from that particular disaster, different programs will open up. But it also starts the conversation on, in addition to those programs that are regularly available, was it big enough and large enough that we're going to need something else to make sure that the producers are going to be okay?
So we actually have 3 different levels. We have county, then escalates to the state, and escalates to the federal. Are they always in synchrony, or sometimes is kind of like the federal thinks is a disaster and then it trails back?
So it depends. I think that it sort of flows up one way for where we would like to request a disaster designation. If the county can demonstrate that they have that 30% loss or more, I don't believe that there would be a case where the state would say, oh, but I'm not going to request one for you. That wouldn't make sense. But just because it's designated a disaster at that federal level, again, like I said, it opens up certain programs, but it doesn't mean that, Congress would meet and have any sort of ad hoc relief program. Sometimes it does. In the past, in some of the hurricane seasons, you saw things like the WHIP program or some of these other sort of additional congressional budget items that were in response to a natural disaster. That doesn't always happen, but that is another thing that can be opened up because a disaster was designated. And then when that does happen, it often comes back to the state level for whether it's FSA or at the state level, or whether that is something like FDACS that sort of decides how that relief will be distributed geographically and across the different commodity groups.
And it gets tricky when one county was declared and another, like there was a line, like these, 67 counties, 48 of them were declared a disaster. Well, what about those ones that maybe didn't have quite as much damage, but maybe they thought they had damage to a particular industry or a particular crop or whatever? So it makes it kind of interesting sometimes. So
yeah, and you mentioned that there are 26 counties that were already designated for these winter freeze events this year in Florida. You can find a list of those counties on the USDA's website. It's not a final decision, so there is still you can still report to the FSA because this process can be updated over time as additional information is available. So there are many counties that did what is known as requested a deferral to later in the season when they get closer to harvest time to really understand, did they meet that 30% threshold or not?
It's a multi-layered response to a multi-layered problem.
And that's only to designate a disaster. That's not even everything involved in other types of response and relief.
It's pretty much the bureaucratic part.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think it's also when you're talking about like our research, you're talking about multiple hits. So thinking about that kind of multiple hit theory of some of the work that we've done. Okay, we've had a freeze. Okay, we've had a drought. Okay, we're 2 months away from hurricane season now as well. So, you're talking about, sorry, I'm always looking at the calendar. So you're talking about some of these folks that were severely impacted by the freeze, who are also impacted by the drought as well. And all of a sudden we're getting into hurricane season and they potentially could be impacted by that as well. So it gets into some of the multiple hits and what's the overall impact, not only from an economic standpoint, but from understanding the impact within the community and how the industry carries on after some of these hits over and over again.
I just had to search this online here as you're talking because hurricane already. So this is an El Nino year, and I just put on the search engine here, El Nino hurricane impact. And it says that hopefully it can tear hurricanes apart and make it less.
Our fingers are crossed.
Yes.
Our fingers are crossed.
Very, very much so.
But the other side.
I was going to say there's probably another side of an El Nino year while we're speaking about drought, because maybe it tears up the hurricanes, but it does something else.
Yeah.
Correct. And I was actually talking to my neighbor yesterday because pecans are starting to grow. They start to break dormancy. We need to fertilize. Fertilizer prices increased, I think 50% in the past couple of weeks and going high. And I'm telling him, it's going to go higher. Let's fertilize. And he said, there is no rain. We don't have moisture. And he said, I'm almost wishing for a hurricane to get some of the moisture replenished.
Careful what you ask for.
But tropical storm.
A storm.
Or even a system.
It can be a big problem.
Sure.
I want to go back with you here to one of the things that I think is the most important message that I want to leave today, which is the reporting. And you mentioned the county process, you mentioned the FSA, the Farm Services Agency in your research. Your research is helping dictate the response as much as the Farm Service Agency data. So let's unpack this a little bit, because I think this is extremely important for our listeners to understand, and to understand why we're asking all those questions. Why are we bothering our farmers with those types of questions in a moment of emergency? Because we need that info. And if you gave it to us, go ahead and also go to the county, go to the USDA to record it there too.
So again, we're going to unpack several things here. and I'm really glad that you asked this question, because it's really important. And I'm going to touch on other types of reporting as well that are important to the process that have nothing to do with the disaster impact itself. So what we do here in our research is, like I said, focus on that rapid assessment of what happens right after a particular disaster for this year's production. The things that go into that process are the data that we pull on the event, which is readily available from National Weather Service or the National Hurricane Center, depending on what type of event it is, very quickly after the storm. We process that. We then have this database that we keep updated on what crops and animals are where in the state of Florida and what is the average value per acre or value per animal for these. We keep that updated annually. A lot of it is based on data from the USDA or data from FDEX. So often when I'm at a grower meeting during blue skies, let's say, I'm not there to talk about a particular event, I remind them that if you haven't filled out the census of agriculture, or you filled out the census of agriculture in a way that maybe wasn't quite representative of your farm, it's affecting that baseline data that I have to say what is where and how much is it worth when we're hit by an event. And then the last part for the disaster impact assessment is we do have a survey that goes out to individuals. It used to be that only an extension agent could fill out that survey for a grower. But after Hurricane Ian, we got the permissions that growers can do it themselves. So you'll see a lot of branded UF-IFAS Economic Impact Analysis Program is doing this disaster assessment. There's a flyer. You could go to an online survey. We have a paper survey. Often the extension offices or the research and education centers, some of them are available for people to come in and get help with filling out that survey there. But that information tells me what happened after this particular event. Because if you can imagine, trying to do a statewide assessment of what happened to all of agriculture is a big endeavor for someone who's an economist and doesn't have an ag background themselves. So I've learned a lot over the last 6 years, but I need to know from the boots on the ground what actually happened to make that number as accurate as possible. Why does that matter? The other group, again, that I mentioned was that the USDA Farm Service Agency is collecting information, similar information, not exactly the same, for that disaster designation process. In order to have a disaster designation, the information has to flow through the FSA. You mentioned it's a bureaucratic process. That's where they get that information so that it can go in front of that county emergency board and then the state emergency board and then be decided on at the federal level. FSA does not try to analyze that or roll it up or try to determine what's that overall impact to a particular area's agricultural losses. And the FSA have individual information. They're not allowed to share that out with researchers. So the reason we're each asking is we can't use each other's data and we're using it for very different things. Mine can't necessarily be used for that disaster designation, but I do participate in those state emergency board meetings as a non-voting member to provide a view of what we are seeing through our survey, so that if maybe there's a county where no one has reported to their county office that 30% loss or more, but I can look to my survey and say, I have multiple, you should go, try to find these people. I wouldn't share the individual information of who was reporting, but it lets them know, get back out into the field. I think you can find it, and we want to include that county in that disaster. So I guess the takeaway here is that multiple groups are asking, but we're asking for different reasons. And our information is being used to sort of guide that process. We work with local government officials, we work with state government officials, and we work with the federal government officials as they are making those decisions related to disaster designation, disaster response, and disaster relief.
Thank you so much for being here with us today. And for those listeners that enjoy this podcast, please make sure to like and also follow us on our social media. We'd like to hear from you. Leave your comments in our social media or reach out to us through forages@ifas.ufl.edu. See you in the next Cal Talks podcast. Thank you. This podcast was brought to you by the University of Florida Forest Team with technical support from the UF CAUS Faculty Instructional Resource and Support Team. This episode was produced by Marcelo Wallau, Olivia Mowley, and Ashley Kalabrowski. I hope you have enjoyed this conversation. And if you have any feedback, please leave us a comment in our social media or send us an email to forages@ifas.ufl.edu. Until the next one.